Hi, beautiful people. Welcome to the Fort Salem Library, where we read you your fanfiction. So sit down or don't, relax or don't, and enjoy these stories in a way you have not before. We at Fort Salem Library do not own Motherland Fort Salem or any of the related characters. The Motherland Fort Salem series is created by Elliot Lawrence and owned by Freeform. This story is a work of fanfiction and is meant for entertainment only. We are not making any profit from these stories. All rights of the original Motherland Fort Salem story belong to Freeform. We also do not own Her Song is a Sin, or any of its original characters and storylines. We did, however, get permission from the author to read their story. This story was created and written by Lou1, and you can find the link in our show notes. This story is being read to you by me, Britt. Her Song is a Sin. Chapter 24. Scylla grabbed at Rael's wrist as the blonde started to place a call. "What are you doing?" Rael's brow furrowed at the panic in the musician's voice. "I'm calling Agent Alder and Tally. They need to know about this." "Don't," Scylla said. Her eyes were afraid and her voice a plea. "This could be relevant," Rael said, shaking her head. "Besides, they're spending a lot of time trying to get at the information in these files. Now they won't need to." "We weren't supposed to tell." "That was years ago, Syl, and you didn't do anything wrong." "Please." Rael met the fractured azure gaze of the woman she loved and put the phone down with a sigh. She needed to get this intel to the FBI, but waiting a little while probably wouldn't make that huge of a difference. "Okay, Scylla. We can wait a bit." Scylla's eyes closed as she leaned her head back against the headboard of the bed, silent tears still running down her face. Rael shifted, taking Scylla's hand that was gripped around her wrist into hers and squeezing it gently. "I'm so sorry you had to go through all of that. None of that changes us. I love you. I'm in this with you." Finally, the musician's eyes opened and met Rael's pale blue gaze. Her heart caught at the sight. She'd been so scared to see disgust or at the least a distancing from her. Instead, the bodyguard's gaze was clear and filled with love. Scylla smiled at Rael, and the blonde moved in closer, providing the comfort she needed till they both fell asleep. Porter had been there for Scylla through some of her most difficult times. When he saw Scylla and Rael walk into the dining area, the longtime friend immediately noticed a difference in the musician, and not her brother, who was sitting right beside him. He nudged Byron, and with a look of curiosity he gestured towards the girls. As Scylla walked into the dining area for a late breakfast, she kept having the sensation that something wasn't quite right with her. She felt different, lighter, not so guarded. The secret guilt she'd carried with her, made her companion through the years, had finally been lifted. Telling the woman that she loved her horrible secret made it bearable. She felt eyes on her, and her blue gaze settled on her childhood friend. She could see the concern in his kind blue eyes, and she gave him a reassuring smile. Rael and Scylla sat at the table, joining Byron and Porter. "Dad and Quinn already up?" "Up and out," Porter said. He took one of the mugs by the coffee carafe and poured a cup for Scylla, and then repeated the action for Rael. He gestured towards the pan of still hot cinnamon rolls on the table. "Something about going to town for supplies." "Good," Rael responded, and took the coffee from the security guard. She grabbed a cinnamon roll and sat back in her chair. "Then we can talk openly. Scylla told me about what happened by the pond." Byron and Porter exchanged glances and then looked at Rael. "What do you want to know?" Porter asked. "Well, Scylla admits to being extremely high when it happened. I'd like to hear your version of the events." The security guard nodded. "That was the day Helen dared you to kiss me, wasn't it?" Scylla looked up from her own cinnamon roll that she'd put on a plate and nodded. "Yeah. I got so pissed when I heard Helen dare you guys," Byron admitted. "I was crazy about Clay, and I was so afraid you two would hook up officially or something and he'd stop coming around." Porter shook his head. And I had the hots for you, but you were too obsessed over trying to appease Clay to notice. Byron looked at Porter, noticing the words he used. Appease Clay? He'd never given the blonde much attention before that day on the trial ride, but now it seemed like he saw another side of the blonde more and more each day they talked. We'd been out shooting at cans in the clearing, hadn't we? Byron asked. He looked at Rael. The same place where you set up the shooting range? Yeah, and when we got back to the pond, that's when Scylla called me over to the hothouses. Clay got back to us just as we kissed, Porter said, smiling at the musician. I didn't even realize he was there until the last minute. I just remember we both kind of just looked at each other and started laughing. You weren't a bad kisser, though, Scylla said. Porter laughed. You weren't so bad yourself, just not my type. Scylla smiled. No, that much was obvious. Why wasn't it obvious to all of us? Byron asked, still shocked he had missed the signs this whole time. I mean, even though I liked Clay, you never said anything. You never gave any indication that you were gay. Rael watched the three before her. She needed to hear their version of the events that occurred that night, but she also knew the more relaxed they were, the more likely they were to give accurate and candid recollections. Your dad, Scylla said, remembering one time that Porter had come over panicked and sporting a black eye. Yeah, Porter confirmed. My parents were insanely homophobic. Just the thought that their golden boy might be queer sent my dad in a rage. So I learned to act the other way, as macho as I could, but of course I never really dated. No, Byron said, remembering this too. I just assumed you were holding out for my sister. That would have been a cold day in hell, Porter said, and they all laughed. What happened after the kiss? Rael asked, gently prodding the group along. Byron looked over at Rael, almost forgetting she was there as they discussed their memories for so long ago. Well, we were done with target shooting, so we met up with Helen and Scylla. From there, we all went to the pond. We were, of course, drinking and getting high, the typical Friday night at the Ramshorns, Byron said. Except there wasn't anything typical about a boy committing suicide in front of his so-called friends and girlfriend, Rael thought. Tell me about what you did at the pond that night. Porter shrugged, blushing. We were all pretty wasted. I remember Helen egging us on, drink after drink. We were tripping on the mushrooms, too. Yeah, Helen was the one that got the bright idea to start stealing them from the hothouse. Helen wanted to play Truth or Dare again, Porter said. Byron looked at Scylla. I remember it was your turn and you picked Truth. It was my fault. I'd been mouthing it at you, hoping you would say Dare. Why? Scylla asked. I thought she might dare you to kiss Porter again, Byron said. But Truth was worse. That's right. She asked me who I liked better. Girls or boys, Scylla said. I remember that now. Goddess, we had just been together while you were all out. The musician shook her head again. I answered, admitting that I preferred girls. Clay got so pissed, Porter said. Scylla nodded. I remember he told Helen that her games were stupid, kid stuff. Right, and then she told him to come up with something better, Porter said. He told us about that stupid war movie, The Game. Goddess, what was it? Scylla asked. The Deer Hunter, Byron said. So that's how it started? Rael asked. Yeah, Porter said. We were all like, hell no, that's crazy, it's too dangerous. But Helen was relentless once Clay mentioned it, called him a chicken shit. Scylla nodded. The conversation bringing back the memories. Clay gave the gun to her first. We were so fucking stupid, Porter said. We all took a turn. And then Clay got the gun, and he shot himself, Scylla said. Byron and Porter exchanged a look and then nodded their agreement. Rael had noticed the look and met each of their eyes in turn. And that's it? Yeah, Porter said. I ran up to the house to get help, and I took Scylla away from the pond. I didn't want her seeing him there. So what happened to Helen? Rael asked. She stayed with the body. With Clay, Byron said, correcting Porter. And then what happened? Rael asked. Dad came out and he ran into me and Scylla first. He had us go to the house. He told us to change, to get out of the clothes we were in, because when we went over to Clay, we ended up getting blood on us." "I don't remember that," Scylla admitted. "No, you were still in shock. You had me worried, just staring out ahead of you, expressionless. You also had tears coming down your face, but you were silent. I don't think I heard you say much of anything for the rest of that night," Byron said, pulling his eyes away from his sister, reliving that night and back at Rael. "My dad must have gone on out to the pond, because he came back a little while later with Helen. And then we all waited for the police." Rael nodded. She was satisfied with the account that they gave of the events. She'd wait and call Tally later to let her know that she had the information they had wanted about the sealed files. They finished their story, then finished their breakfast and talked about their plans for the day. It was too cold to ride, so each had their own ideas of activities to keep themselves occupied in the house. Helen was bored. She'd finished decorating the grounds for Thanksgiving, though with Ramshorn's siblings out hiding away in God knows what place, the likelihood of anyone coming by to enjoy the sight of her hard work was unlikely. She'd even helped Parker do the fall cleaning in anticipation of the holidays, and had helped him decorate the inside of the house. Parker had always been that neutral guy anyone felt comfortable with. As long as Helen had known him, he had been the Ramshorn's butler, but he was like everyone's uncle. They'd made their way down to the basement and even sorted the Christmas decorations that they'd soon put up around the mansion. Scylla had always been very specific about what went up and where. The musician had insisted on recreating that last Christmas that she'd remembered having with her parents. Now that the work was completed and there was absolutely nothing to do, Helen wandered around the house thinking about what she could do to occupy herself. She knew she would have to check in on the plants she had in the hothouse at some point. The weather was getting too cold for her outside garden, but that could wait until later. Finally, she decided to raid the kitchen for some lunch and found Isadora there at the island, eating a salad. "How's things going?" Helen asked conversationally, as she opened the refrigerator to look for something to put on a sandwich. "Fine," Isadora answered. When the manager didn't say anything else, Helen turned to her with a smirk. "Guess you're about as busy as me." "Yes," Isadora admitted. "It's so quiet without them." Helen brought her armful of sandwich supplies to the table and began assembling her lunch. "I wish we knew if they were okay." "Byron checked in yesterday," Isadora said. "He seemed to be in a good mood." Helen's eyes widened. "Did he say where they were?" Isadora shook her head. "Just that it had been nice enough day to go for a ride." "A car ride?" Helen asked, brows furrowed. Isadora put down her fork and stood to place the empty plate in the sink to be rinsed before going into the dishwasher. "No, horseback riding." Helen snorted. "You're kidding me." "No, I'm not," Isadora said. Helen shook her head. She remembered that Porter used to ride somewhere as a kid. Tennessee? No, Texas, where some of his family lived. She couldn't imagine Byron on a horse, though. "Did he say anything about Scylla?" Isadora met Helen's gaze evenly. She'd never really liked the woman. She was lazy and cocky. Scylla had brought her into her employ very early on, though, and made it clear to Isadora that after everything they had all gone through together as teenagers, both Helen and Porter were to always have a place in her household. They were paid, and paid very well. While Porter genuinely seemed to try to do his job and really flourished under the tutelage of Rael in the security department, Helen coasted through her duties as groundkeeper and then driver. She always seemed to have time for her little private pet projects and side jobs as a casual drug dealer. Isadora had taken her complaints to Scylla, but the musician shook her head and said she would have a talk with Helen. Even Byron just shrugged and told her that Scylla wouldn't dare fire her friend and ex-lover. "Well?" Helen asked, breaking the manager's train of thought. Isadora looked up at Helen, her expression gleeful. "Byron just said that she and Rael had worked things out." "Good for them," Helen said, her voice flat. "Yes, hopefully Rael will stay around long after this nasty business is finished." "Yeah," Helen said, taking a bite of the sandwich she no longer wanted. Picking it up and tossing it in the trash, she looked at the manager. "See you around." Isadora smirked. pleased at herself for getting a jab at the groundskeeper. "Have a great afternoon, Helen." Helen stalked out of the mansion. Her temper flared. She wasn't surprised that the bitch bodyguard and Scylla had found their way back to each other. Scylla was weak. She always had needed a strong hand to guide her, and Rael had seemed more than eager to be that hand Scylla craved in the night. She had thought her little gifts would have been enough to bring Scylla running into her arms again, but then her cock-sucking brother and the bitch manager had to get involved and had hired Rael. Now she would have to figure out something else. She'd have to find a way to get rid of the bodyguard, just like she had gotten rid of others. Helen would worry about that later, though. For now, she needed to blow off some steam. She walked out of the mansion and made her way over to the garage. Bypassing the limo and half a dozen other vehicles, she strode towards Scylla's newest acquisition, a metallic gray Carrera Cabriolet Porsche. Getting in and adjusting the seat and mirrors, she grinned. She could really practice some evasive driving in this little baby. She started the engine, appreciating the sound the vehicle made, and pulled out onto the drive. They sat, configuring the next move for the next gift. Like a statue, they stared at the sign above their door. The Father's Anointed Soldier remembered. Palm 121-78. Gifting such a sign, the meaning was engraved in their mind. The verse meant, "Put on the full armor of God so that you can take your stand against the devil's schemes." Things became clearer now. They knew that they had the right tribute that would make a fitting gift to that witch. Lying, self-centered, heartless witch. They saw them. The godless brother may have hoped to send his message to them. Depraved soul. He shouldn't have signed the devil's contract. They would have to think of a way to get the gift, to lure them. This gift, this sacrifice would bring the witch out of her hiding place. If they prepared it right, she'd come running home to her desecrated and unholy place. Her coven would not be able to protect her. God would show him the way. Helen pulled the car back into the garage, still dazed from her little accident. She parked the car, careful to position it in a way that would keep the nosy manager from noticing it if she came into the garage. As she got out of the car and surveyed the damage, she thought, well, hell, what did they expect? They shouldn't have left her behind. In reality, it wasn't her fault. She had been trying to be proactive and responsible by practicing and keeping up with her defensive driving skills. Yup, not her fault. Well, the car's bumper might be considered her fault, but whatever, minor details. Besides, it could be fixed, and with them gone, she'd have the time to get it fixed, and no one would ever know. She just needed to call the body shop. Jason always hooked her up with talented people who would do house visits for the right price, especially if she tossed in a few goodies with the negotiations. The little extras also helped to ensure things would be kept on the down low. Just to make sure that no one noticed the damage, Helen put a cover on the car and then left the garage. As she entered her apartment, she pulled out her cell and placed a call. As soon as Jason's voice came through the tiny speaker, Helen spoke. "I need your best guy." "What did you wreck now?" Jason asked, knowing the groundskeeper's little habit of driving the musician's toys. "Her new Porsche." "Damn, Helen. We're overrun right now. I'm swamped here trying to fix things. The frost last week caused a lot of fender benders." "Come on, Jason. You've got to know somebody." The body shop owner was quiet for a few minutes, and then he said, "Well, I've got this new guy. He's young, a bit of an oddball, but damn, he knows his shit. I work him odd hours because the other guys don't like him. They say he gives them the creeps. So he'll be cheap, but I'll be expecting a little extra for sending him to you." "The usual supply?" Helen asked. "No, don't go cheap on me. I know you got some better stuff than what you sent over last time." Helen laughed because Jason was right. She did have a special little blend that she saved for those occasions Scylla wanted to go on a little trip. Unfortunately, the brunette didn't indulge as much as she used to, so she had plenty that she could give to the mechanic for his troubles. "Only if you get him here this week." "Okay, Helen," Jason answered. "I'll give him a call right now." Satisfied, Helen ended the call and made her way to the fridge to get a beer. "Hello? Hey, it's me, Jason. I've got a job for you. It's a house call." They listened intently as their boss gave a description of the needed repairs in the location. At the mechanic's insistence that the job be started this week, they gave their assurance that they'd start the next day. As they turned the phone off, they smiled and looked up at the scripture on the wall again. God had provided a way, just as they knew would happen. Riel could hear Scylla moving around in the upstairs loft. After they'd watched some TV and spent most of the day being generally lazy, the musician said she was going to start another book before it was time to help Edwin fix dinner, and had headed towards the book nook in the loft. Moving delicately as she could, Riel made her way back downstairs to the main floor and headed into the room. Once there, she pulled out her cell phone. "Ray, thank the goddess you called," Tally said. "Alder still hasn't found a way into the sealed files, but Alice was able to access some of the lab reports and forensics tests. We've got—" "I know what happened," Riel said, interrupting the redhead. "You know what's in the files? Scylla told you?" "Yeah," Riel said, glancing up as she heard movement in the living area. "Look, Tally, I think you should come here and hear it for yourself, and you can bring the forensics over and we can take a look at it. I'm not sure that I can get there in enough time. I've got the number for the guy who flew us here. Just call him and put it on my account." "Now?" "Yeah, Tell, now. If you can get here in the morning, that would be great." Okay," Tally said, looking at the stack of cold cases still sitting on her desk. Some dated back 20 years. It wasn't like they couldn't wait another day or two. "Oh, another thing?" Riel said. "I've got a name Alder should look into. Alban Hurst. He's the guy that caused the crash that killed Scylla's parents, and I've got a hunch it wasn't an accident." "What?" Tally asked. "Why?" Riel heard voices in the living area now. It sounded like Quinn and Edwin were back, and that meant Scylla would be joining her dad in the kitchen any moment. "Look, I'll explain it when you get here. I've got to go." "Okay, Riel. How will I get to the farm?" Tally waited for an answer and then heard the beeping sound that the call had ended. She sighed and then called Alder. She knew that Sarah wasn't going to be happy about this. "How's Smokey Bear?" Porter asked as he walked by the mount and stood beside Byron's easel. The artist was so lost in his work that for a moment Porter thought he'd have to ask again. He was about to do so when Byron commented. "Stuffed." Porter laughed. "Me too. That dinner was pretty good." Byron looked up, meeting the blue eyes of the security guard. "Yeah, Scylla's cooking skills are improving." "Goddess, could you imagine her as a housewife?" Porter asked, laughing. "With a little apron?" Byron added, also laughing. "Now that would be a sight." Porter nodded and offered the artist one of the glasses that he held. "What's this?" Byron asked, taking the glass of a slightly colored liquor. "Butterscotch moonshine." Byron's eyes widened. "You're kidding me." "No. Quinn makes it out on the other farm." Porter took a sip, savoring the taste before swallowing it and allowing the liquor to burn slowly down his throat. He glanced at Byron, smirking slightly, as he saw that he had the artist's rapt attention. Byron looked down at the glass and took a tentative sip, the smell of butterscotch immediately fragrant in his nose. He noticed something else, but he wasn't sure what it was. As he took a sip, he was surprised to find that the liquor was warm. "Exquisite," Byron said. "Why don't you pull up on a chair?" Porter put his glass down on the table where Byron had some of his supplies and walked over to the bar area. He returned, a moment later, with another stool and joined the painter. "Interesting perspective," he said, taking in the canvas before him. Byron looked at the painting of the man beside him and shrugged. "I find myself making revisions almost every day." "Why is that?" Porter asked. "Because every day I learn a little bit more about who you are versus the man I thought I'd known for all these years." Porter met the artist's gaze and smiled. "Still just Porter." "You're a lot more than that, and I'm just sorry it took me so long to realize it." Porter shrugged and turned his gaze back towards the canvas. "You've really grown into the social realism style. You bring out your model in such a way that you portray their personality through a pose. Not just the superficial, are they hot or not, but the complexity of the person themselves. It's in the eyes, posture, facial expression." Byron looked up at Porter, surprised by the security guard insight. "You know about social realism?" Immediately he blushed, embarrassed that he'd once again sold the blonde before him short. Porter nodded, ignoring the implication. I'm just honored to see a piece of yours as it develops. He looked at the canvas again. Byron had captured the scene between Winston's ear perfectly. He gazed at himself, astride Jasper. Behind him, the scenery was as beautiful as what they had seen on the overlook that day. It really is a stunning scene. You are, Byron said, correcting the blonde. The landscape only highlights you. Porter met Byron's gaze, blushing slightly. I hope that I got it right, the artist admitted. There's a few more things about me you don't know yet. Maybe you'd let me show you. I was hoping that you would, Byron responded. Porter nodded, and they both took sips of their drinks as they started to talk about art as Byron continued to paint. As soon as Tally had texted Raelle her ETA to the airfield, the bodyguard made an excuse to find Quinn. It's going to be a cold night, and some of the horses will need extra attention, blankets and such. I'm going to head out to the barn and help her. Scylla looked up from her glass of moonshine and met Raelle's pale blue gaze. They had been enjoying a nice drink of Quinn's latest concoction by the fire. Now? Scylla asked. Yeah, sooner we get to it, the sooner it's done. Raelle leaned over, kissing Scylla's cheek. She moved her mouth, whispering into the musician's ear. And the sooner it's done, the sooner we can go to bed. Scylla's breath caught, and she moved her head to capture the blonde's lips again. Between kisses, she asked, Do you want me to come help? I want you to come, Raelle said with a mischievous smile, but that's after I get back. Scylla laughed despite herself and playfully pushed the blonde away. I don't know. Not with lines that lame. Raelle laughed and left the brunette by the fire. At the barn, Raelle stayed true to what she told the musician, and between the two of them, Quinn and Raelle quickly had the horses bedded down for the night. As they finished the job, Raelle made her request. You want me to get out there at 5? Please, Raelle confirmed. Why don't you just take the truck? I don't want Scylla or the others to know about it until she gets here. If I suddenly leave the farm in the morning, they'll know something is up. Well, Ray, I guess I can do it. Thanks, Quinn. Should have known your help came with a price, the older woman groused. Raelle laughed, throwing her arms around the older woman's shoulder as they headed back towards the house. By the time Raelle returned to the house, Scylla had already made her way upstairs. Raelle reached the top of the steps just as Scylla stepped from the bathroom, hair still wet and wearing a robe. The bodyguard stopped in her tracks, just looking at the beautiful woman before her. The woman she loved. The woman she had come to realize she wanted to marry and grow old with. Coming to bed? Scylla teased. Yeah. Raelle managed and followed the brunette into the bedroom and shut the door behind him. Raelle finished making her morning sweep of the property and met Scylla at the swing, as was their custom. This morning the coffee had a slightly nutty flavor, and Raelle looked at Scylla, her brow arched in question. It's maple pecan. Your dad picked up while he and Quinn were out yesterday. I like it, Raelle said, and snuggled closer to the musician. The sunrise was as beautiful as always, but couldn't compare to the sight of Scylla sitting beside her, a content smile on her face. They watched Mother Nature show for a few more minutes before the cold got to even Scylla, and they made their way back into the warmth of the log house. Walking through the front door, Scylla spotted a familiar redhead right away, nursing a mug of coffee at the dining table. The musician's eyes widened in shock. She reached for Raelle's arms, gripping her bicep, and tugged. With that look that said, "We're leaving," she jerked the blonde into the kitchen and whirled on her, blue eyes flashing. Ray tried to convey a comforting look to the musician. Yes, I called her. We have to talk to her, Syl. This could help them with this case. I wouldn't do this if I didn't trust Tal. She won't do anything without your consent, and she won't let anyone know where we're at. Did you see Aller there? No, it's only her. Scylla shook her head, angry at Raelle for calling Tally, and the redhead coming to this place that she had started to think of as a safe place. A refugee where she could be herself, where she could heal. I don't know how any of that can help with what's going on now. It could be relevant, maybe in ways we don't even know yet. Besides, Alder's like a dog with a bone. She won't let this go until she has the truth. You might as well get this off your chest so that you can move on and catch the person doing this. We weren't supposed to talk about it, Scylla said, her protest weakening. I won't let anything happen to you. We're in this together. I'm not protecting you if we just let this psycho run out free. Hiding you away forever isn't protecting you. None of what happened was your fault. You were just kids. Your parents, the police who were involved, they all failed you. You should have never been made to feel like any of this was your fault. That someone who killed your parents should go free while you suffered for something you didn't do. I'll keep telling you this till my last breath. None of that or this was your fault. But we can't hide out here forever. If we have to tell this story to get the case to move forward, then that's what we need to do. And I'll be with you every step of the way. A look of sadness and relief came across the musician's face, hearing Riel say those words. Not her fault. Not her fault. The words echoed in her mind. For someone who took the guilt and carried it for so long, this was the first time that she truly considered those words to be true. It was one thing to tell the person she loved the truth, but hearing her at that moment was something different. Then she thought about the reality of knowing that Riel was right. They couldn't keep hiding. Not while she and her family were in danger. Not when other innocent girl may be harmed because of a psycho hellbent on ruining her life. Tears started to build under the musician's deep crystal blue eyes. No more hiding, Scylla asked. The words came out more as a statement than a question. Riel gave Scylla a reassuring smile. Yes, no more hiding out. Doesn't mean I can see us living here later, without a psycho looking for us. That was more along the lines of my retirement plans. The musician's eyes widened at her bodyguard's confession, and she shook her head yes after a moment. Okay, I'll talk to her. They both smiled, and Scylla took Riel's hand in hers, interlocking their fingers. We're in this together, the bodyguard reminded Scylla. They both started walking out of the kitchen and towards the dining table. Scylla felt the anxiety in her heart build. Each step felt lighter, like she was about to pass out. Holding the blonde's hand kept her grounded when her first instinct was to run. She'd been a runner since she could remember, running from her emotions, running from taking responsibility for the consequences of her actions. Looking at the blonde leading the way, she knew her priorities had changed. Now her, them, their love. It was something real to fight for. Tally offered a tentative wave at Scylla and Riel as they approached the dining room table and took a seat. How was the flight? Riel asked. Oh, good, Tally answered. Look, I'm just going to say this up front. Sarah is pissed about this. I'm sorry I put you in a bad spot with her, Riel said, and she meant it. She loved her best friend and she wanted her to be happy. Instead, she'd risked that to help her and a woman who'd already done her harm once before. She'll get over it, Tally said, shrugging. But she wants answers. Clear answers, so we can move on with this. Scylla nodded and looked at the redhead. I guess you want me to start from the beginning? Tally nodded and Riel poured them cups of coffee. After a moment, Scylla started to tell Tally all about the day at the pond. Partially through the events, Porter and Byron joined them at the table, and Tally asked them a few clarifying questions. Once they had finished, the redhead looked at her best friend and frowned. What's wrong, Tal? The redhead shook her head and pulled a file from her bag that was resting on the floor. I'm sorry, but your story doesn't match the forensics. But that's what happened, Scylla protested. She didn't understand why, after she told the truth, she was still being looked at like she was some sort of criminal. You were very drunk and very high, and according to Porter and Byron, it was a very traumatizing event. It was, but that's what happened. Tally sighed and then put her hand out to the musician and squeezed it. Look, I'm not here as an agent. I'm here as Riel's friend, as potentially your friend. Maybe you don't remember what happened accurately. Besides Scylla, Porter and Byron looked at each other, but did not speak. Brows furrowed, Riel looked at her friend. What does the forensics say? Tally let go of Scylla's hand and rifled through the file until she found the right report. The gun recovered from the scene had 4 unidentified partial prints in addition to the boys that were lifted from the gun. Right, they were playing Russian roulette. You should have at least partial prints from all of them. True. However, we still have to consider something else. Scylla and Clay's prints were the only 2 clear enough that we were able to pull an ID. So, that just indicates that they were probably the last two to play, Rael argued. Telly sighed, looking at Scylla and then to her best friend. The boy had only partial powder residue on his hand. So? Scylla asked, her voice a squeak. She'd been looking back and forth at Telly and Rael, trying to understand what all of this meant, but none of it made sense to her. She could see that Byron and Porter were looking more and more nervous as she was close to snapping. He wasn't the only one who had a hand on the gun when it was fired, Rael said, and then looked around at the people who had been there that night. Your recollection, it's wrong. Incomplete, Telly amended, but with the forensics on the prints. Will somebody just fucking tell me what you mean? Scylla asked. He made you, Byron blurted out and then put his hand over his mouth in shock. Telly looked at Scylla's brother and nodded as he continued to speak. Your hand was on the trigger. No, Scylla said. Frantically, she searched her memories, forcing herself to relive that event one more time. The last thing she remembered was the gun, the scream. He'd been on the swing, hadn't he? Porter gave Byron's shoulder a squeeze with his hand and then spoke up. The police, Mr. Ramshorn, they forbade us to tell what really happened that night. Scylla was in shock. She really doesn't remember. After it was over, I tried to bring it up to her to see if she did remember. He looked over at his friend apologetically. I had to know, you know? Scylla nodded. I remember that. After a while, I just wanted to let it go, but you kept asking me to tell you what had happened, what I saw, but it was just blank. Rael looked at the security guard. So what happened at the end? This time it was Byron's turn to look off in the distance as if the past was playing before him. We took turns with the gun. And then Clay got it after Helen. He was on the swing and he fired. The gun clicked. Then he did it again and it clicked. Scylla told him to stop, Porter said. He looked at his friend. You told him to stop. You got up and started walking to the swing. He met you just by the tree. He said something to you. I didn't hear it. Byron shook his head. I couldn't hear it either. He was whispering. But I know that it scared you. You grabbed the gun from him and you were walking away with it. And then he grabbed your arm, Porter said. He jerked her into him. He looked around, desperate for Rael and Tally to understand. Clay forced you to put the gun to his head, and he put his hand over yours. He had his finger on your finger, and he squeezed. He shot himself. He forced Scylla to shoot him, Telly clarified. Yes, Byron and Porter both shouted in unison. The artist continued. Whatever was happening, we all saw fear and confusion in Scylla's eyes. We were all frozen. It happened so fast. Rael looked at Tally and frowned. That was what had happened, and whether it was intentional or forced, Scylla's finger was on the trigger when the kill shot had happened. And that was what Mr. Ramshorn was really trying to hide. Not just the drugs or the fact that his kids were present when a boy committed suicide. The police covered up, and the sealed files made much more sense now. So it was my fault, Scylla asked, her voice flat. Porter and Byron both shook their hands. No, you tried to stop him, Syl, Porter said. You lost it after it happened, Byron said. You had his blood all over you. The artist shuddered at the memory. You collapsed and I went to you. I got you to the house. This wasn't your fault, Rael said, repeating what she'd already said at least a dozen times, and then looked at Tally. He was clearly unstable. He wanted to kill himself. He wanted to hurt the person that he felt had wronged him. The forensics support this, Tally agreed. And that supports my theory. Alban Hurst could be the person doing this. Some sort of twisted revenge for what happened to his son, the bodyguard said, clenching her jaw. Maybe, Tally agreed. I gave the name to Sarah and she's got the team checking into it today. Alder also has forensic going over all the evidence collected so far, again with a fine-tooth comb, just to make sure we haven't missed anything. Rael nodded. Okay, well let's see what they and Alder come up with. Tally closed the file and looked at her friend. I have to be back to the office in a couple days. What are your plans? I'm tired of hiding, Tal. I'm ready to start hunting. Please find the fanfiction you just listened to on Archive of Our Own and leave the author some love. Without them, this wouldn't be possible, and we want to thank them from the bottoms of our hearts for creating these amazing stories and keeping the show alive.